You're watching live coverage of a National Day of Courage, a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Parks. And I'm here with Danielle McGuire, a professor of history at Wayne State University,
Yes.
and the author of At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Race, and Resistance. I am a big fan of the idea of this book, which really seeks to put Rosa Parks in the context of not just the women who were part of the civil rights movement at that point, but the women who were victims of Jim Crow and the other really discriminating practices that were going on in the South at the time.
Yeah, it's really an incredible story. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the Montgomery NAACP, but she didn't just file papers or take notes. She was a field secretary.
Right.
And that meant she did investigative work for the branch. And so under the cover of darkness, at great risk to herself and her family, she traveled the dusty back roads of Alabama taking notes on acts of violence and interviewing victims and getting their testimony and then carrying it back to Montgomery, where she and the city's most militant leaders would decide whether or not they would wage a campaign or start a protest. And she did this in the 1930s and the 1940s, you know, decades before she had that stand on the bus boycott.
She did what she did on the bus. And that really sort of explains some of why she did what she did and sort of how she must have been feeling at that point. I mean, it's always interesting to me that she's described as being tired on the bus, as if she was tired from work, but what she was really tired of, I think, was all of this other stuff that was going on, and as you point out, for years that she was really close to.
Right. What's interesting is that the Fellowship of Reconciliation made a comic book in 1957, and that's where the tired feet myth started.
Yeah.
Because they were trying to tell a story of the bus boycott in order to present it simply to people so that they could make the boycott happen, or a movement like that happen other places.
In other cities.
To teach other people. And so they needed this kind of heroine.
You need a simple narrative.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that narrative stuck. And it's too bad because she didn't have tired feet, and she said again and again, the only tired I was tired of being pushed around.
Right. You spoke earlier today during a panel in which you were joined by some other authors and historians. You were talking about one of the women who had been a victim of this stuff. I'd love to have you tell a little bit of that story.
Yeah, Reese Taylor.
Yeah.
She's an incredible woman. She's 93. She's still alive. She lives in Florida. She was walking home from church in 1944, minding her own business, and a carload of white men kidnapped her off the street. They drove her to the woods, and they gang raped her at gunpoint. And they kicked her out when they were finished and told her never to tell anyone or they'd kill her. And she told. And, you know, her testimony helped the NAACP in Montgomery hear about the case, and they said they'd send their very best investigator, and that was Rosa Parks.
And it was Rosa Parks.
So Rosa Parks goes down to Abbeville, where her husband's family was from. I'm sorry, her father's family was from, and she took Taylor's testimony. The sheriff saw that she was there, chased her out of town, but she made it to Montgomery, and she told the story, and they launched a nationwide campaign that was huge, and the Chicago Defender called it the largest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade. Amazing. And no one's ever heard about it.
And this is before
it's 11 years before the bus boycott. But all of the people who worked on Reese Taylor's campaign become pillars in the Montgomery Improvement Association. So you start to see the connections. And after that case in 1944, she works on other cases in the late 1940s, including one in 1949, the Gertrude Perkins case, where 2 white Montgomery police officers rape a black woman. And there are other cases into the 1950s that she's a part of, and so are all the people who worked on the Reese Taylor campaign. So the bus boycott is not just about where you sit on the bus, but about what happens to you once you're on the bus.
Once you're on the bus and once you get off and try to walk home. You know, I think very often the civil rights movement is stripped of that context of the violence that was being visited upon black people, black women, black children regularly in the South.
Right, and I think, you know, we talk a lot about the violence. We've learned a lot about lynching. We haven't learned as much about what happened to black women when they were alone, what happened to domestics when they were isolated in white homes and white neighborhoods, when they were totally vulnerable. And the movie didn't say anything about the sexual violence that they were vulnerable to, which was an all too real story.
Right.
And then the other side of it is we talk about the brutality, we don't always talk about the resistance to that brutality.
Right.
And black women are at the forefront of resistance to bodily and sexual violence decades before the women's movement.
Right, right.
They lay the foundation for the women's movement.
Right. So now in your work at Wayne State, teaching young people about this history, how shocked are they to learn in college about these things? I mean, do they have a familiarity with it, or are you imparting this stuff for the first time?
Well, both. I think more and more students coming into college as freshmen know very little about the civil rights movement.
Sure,
it's very
they're
sad.
not teaching it in
They know
school.
about Rosa Parks, but they don't really know about Rosa Parks.
Sure.
But hardly any of them know about Emmett Till. Hardly any of them know who Ella Baker is.
Really?
They don't know the larger story. They know King.
Right.
And that's it. And they know he had a dream, but they don't know anything about his nightmares or what he had to go through.
Right.
So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, yeah.
And events like this can help spread the education.
Is there something hopeful you see in the eyes of those kids in your classroom, though, in terms of that they get it?
Yeah, well, I think that more and more they are not willing to accept basic stereotypes.
Yeah.
That they're a little bit more critical about race, about gender, about sexuality, because they've been raised at a time when they're asked to be critical about it.
Yes, right.
And so they're coming up in a different era.
In a totally different
era.
And
that enables them to be open to hearing this history in a way that can broaden their minds, and then I think help them broaden the world that we live in.
Yeah. Okay. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
Wonderful to hear you speak.